And welcome back, everybody. Another edition here of the Auburn Undercover podcast on the 24/7 Sports Network. My name is Nathan King. I'm joined today by Christian Clemente and Jason Caldwell. Kind of wanted to just do a bit of a catch-all episode here as the transfer portal is coming to a close. It's already closed up for football. It's getting set to close for basketball, and obviously some recruiting going on there. Auburn's got visitors, or they did have a visitor today for basketball. Got a visitor on campus for football as well. And I wanted to let Jason and Christian obviously get to their recruiting info for the week. And we also took some questions from folks on the board, on the message board. So we'll answer those as well. Before we get started, Christian, I believe you finished as the winner in last week's roster draft. Do you have any comments on your victory?
No, I mean, it was locked up when I got the 1-1 pick and I got Cam Coleman. I mean, if you get the fan favorite, you're going to get the fan vote. So,
yeah, you're doing some good campaigning on the board as well. I probably should have gone a little harder in that regard, but yeah, that was fun. We appreciate everybody for voting on that, and it was a fun show as always. So, like I mentioned, transfer portal. That's what we'll get into first. We'll start with basketball because they were supposed to have 2 visitors on campus this week. It ended up that RJ Godfrey, a Clemson transfer, whom Auburn was looking to get on campus because obviously they're trying to replace Jalen Williams, not necessarily a 1-to-1 replacement, but get somebody to bring in there at that 4 spot. They're now still searching for that because RJ Godfrey ended up backing out of his visit and committed to Georgia the next day. We record this here on Wednesday, so not a huge surprise there. His dad played at Georgia, but obviously it puts Auburn back, not square one, because I think if we weren't surprised that Georgia was in the picture, Auburn's staff certainly wasn't surprised. And so, they are obviously doing their due diligence with other guys at that position. But a transfer visitor they did have on campus left today, Duke Miles from High Point University. He was a first-team All-Big South point guard this season. And the thing about Duke Miles is this is not somebody who is unfamiliar with Auburn, is not somebody that is unfamiliar with this area. And this state, he's from Robert E. Lee High School in Montgomery, won a state championship there, and then played at Troy for 3 seasons. And so this is somebody who is very, very familiar with Auburn, decided to go to High Point to get more playing time, ended up, again, being a first-team all-conference guy there. And we talked to him after his visit today, and he said it's always been a dream of his to play at Auburn. He said he grew up interested in Auburn basketball. Obviously, living in Montgomery, that's not hard to believe, not far from Auburn's campus. And Jason, as they try to fill in these 2 roster spots, we'll see what happens moving forward with that 4 spot. But here at point guard, there's a few things you could check off from a guy like Duke Miles, somebody who's close to home, from right down the road, someone who told us he doesn't have any other visits planned at the moment, and somebody who said he has a decision coming in just a few days. All of those signs seem to point that this is probably pretty likely he'll be the next guy here for Auburn, and that makes it so that it is a full reset for them at the point guard position with a couple transfers.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. A full reset, almost a full roster reset in 2 years. Obviously, you'll have Broome and Dylan Cardwell, but I mean, you look at and Chris Moore's still there, but there'll be a lot of new faces that you had last year, but it's going to be the second year for a lot of those guys, and I think that's a big deal. And then I think you look at, already having JP Pegues, Duke Miles, and that's a really intriguing point guard spot with experience, different styles of play a little bit. Duke Miles is a little bit more physical guy. Nathan, you got a chance to see him today, but he's a little bit bigger body than they've had at point guard in a while. And so I think it's really interesting. And so, I think they've helped themselves. Obviously getting Broome and Cardwell back and keeping these guys has been big. Getting Pegues, Duke Miles, and not as much turnover and change for this Auburn roster as many others. And so it kind of feels like they haven't done as much, but they've done what they needed to do. And you're right. Can you add another forward? I think they'll still continue to look, but you had to have the point guard spot locked up, and adding Duke Miles would do that.
Yeah, because of how important that second point guard is to run that second unit, you had to get somebody important there. You had to get somebody you felt like was a good fit. Yeah, Miles, a little bit bigger, 6'3", 17.5 points a game last season, 36% shooter from beyond the arc. He kind of, when watching him on tape, and not that JP Pegues isn't fearless, because he absolutely is a guy who can get his shot anytime. But Pegues is a little bit more of a true kind of facilitator. You watch Miles, and fearless is kind of the word that comes to mind. He's just somebody who's able to create for an offense. And so I think if you're Auburn, again, this is not a done deal, but it certainly seems like it's trending that way. We'll, of course, update if there's anything else on that front. And then, yeah, that 4 spot, we'll see that they've been in communication with a few different targets. That's probably something they're going to want to turn over pretty quickly here. So we'll see if they're able to get another transfer visitor here on campus in the near future. But that's when you can tinker with, and you're already really, excited about what Chaney Johnson brings next season. So like Jason said, point guard, though, is something you absolutely had to have. On the football front in the transfer portal, it closed up on today at midnight today. As we record this here on Wednesday, closes up at midnight tonight, moving into Thursday for grad transfers. But Christian, as we have learned over the past few years, that doesn't mean that there won't still be some names trickling in, because programs have 48 hours to process that paperwork. So we'll continue to see that maybe at Auburn. I don't think we're expecting many other guys to leave, but across the country, you will still see guys exiting the portal, heading out. And so Auburn did have a transfer visitor on campus, though, today, moving into tomorrow. Khalil Jacobs, the South Alabama linebacker. Christian, tell us a little bit about him, what you know about his recruitment. And, we thought linebacker could be a group that Auburn maybe would go after to shore things up, and it seems like they're going to do that.
Yeah, I mean, he's an interesting player. He's kind of, Jason, we were just on the road checking out Eric Winters. He's kind of similar to Eric Winters. I think, he's listed as a linebacker. I think he'd play more of a star role in DJ Durkin's defense if he were to end up at Auburn. Now, the key there is if he ends up at Auburn. So far, Auburn's 4 for 4 on spraying transfer guys, targets that they've gone after and that have visited and gotten a signing from. This one's a little bit different. Khalil Jacobs visiting Auburn, got there on Tuesday, supposed to leave Thursday morning. But he's also going to go check out Missouri, and he's also going to check out Alabama. He has a connection to the Missouri staff. He has a very obvious connection to the Alabama staff with Kane Womack there as the defensive coordinator. So it's a tough battle for sure, but it's one that Auburn is squarely in. They would not be getting a visit if they're not in. And it's kind of a position where, you have a guy like a T Love. You have some of these other guys that can kind of play that star position a little bit. But I think that's something that they're trying to build up a little bit more for DJ Durkin's defense. And I think this would be one of those guys who would also obviously provide depth there at linebacker as well.
Yeah, the interesting thing about this one is can Auburn do what was done to them in that January period, which is you get the visit before the other visits, and can you wrap it up and say, hey, we're done? It's gonna be tough. But I think in this portal where we've seen having the early visit pays off. We'll see if this one pays off for Auburn, because obviously you're right. Linebacker is not a huge need, but this is also somebody that can help you bridge the gap a little bit, because Auburn has a group of older guys and a group of younger guys, and Robert Woodyard is the only guy in between. So they're either all older or they're all really young. So, this would be somebody to help you, kind of help get to that young group and give them a little bit of, seasoning, for next year. So interesting player, really kind of came into his own as he's continued to grow and mature. I still think he's a guy that probably in the end probably ends up weighing it, playing at 225 and is very similar to a guy like Eugene Asante. Now we'll see if he's that speedy guy, but I think similar type maybe fit in this scheme where you're really aggressive, getting downhill and see what he can do.
Yeah, like Christian mentioned, they've been perfect so far getting guys on campus and sealing the deal on them. It's a 4-man transfer class at the moment. All 4 of them have been at really important positions. Philip Bleedy from Indiana, a true kind of 3-tech defensive lineman. Isaiah Rakes might be a little bit more of a nose, bigger guy there from Texas A&M and USC in the spring. Karon Crawford, the pass rusher from Arkansas State. And then guys we haven't been on here, I don't believe, since they landed Keandre Lambert-Smith. And that was something that was absolutely huge, Christian. That was a really big splash. One of the top players in the portal overall. I think we had him rated at the time as the number 2 receiver in the portal, but just one of the guys who was being looked at, period, from programs all across the country. And Jason said it when we exited the spring. It needed to be a guy. It needed to be a dude that you thought fit into things really well. It's hard to argue against a guy who was going to be the top returning receiver in the Big Ten. But Christian, they go out and land him. It's another really big move for Marcus Davis as Auburn's receivers coach, and in terms of his recruiting, both at the high school and the transfer level. And they get a guy who absolutely has shown he can be a top level receiver at the Power 5 level.
Yeah, I kind of want to actually dive into one of the questions from the board here, because this kind of goes with my answer, so I don't want to double dip here. But UGA Hater asked, do the transfer portal additions on the football team equal more wins? And we can touch on the second part of the restructuring of the offense, improving Thorne's performance later on. But in terms of the portal additions, I looked at guys like Rakes, guys like Bleedy, guys like Kieron Crawford as floor raisers a little bit. You had to get those guys. I think the Vegas win total for Auburn is 7.5. If you wanted to get to that 7 number, you needed those guys. You needed more guys along the defensive line. If you didn't have them, you could be looking at 6 wins. You could be looking at kind of a disaster. You needed those guys to get to that 7 point. Keandre Lambert-Smith is the ceiling guy for me. He's the guy that gets you to that 8th win, maybe a 9th win or a bowl game win to get you to 9 or something like that. I don't think he is a top tier, truly elite number 1 wide receiver, but he's done it at this level, played in the Big Ten for 4 years. He's played all 4 years. So he's done it for a while now. Jason, that's something that we talked about going into the spring portal window. They needed to get a guy, and no disrespect to the guys they got last year, but you got a guy from North Texas. You got a guy from Jackson State. They only had a handful of fall practices. They didn't have a good opportunity to really get used to playing in the SEC, playing at this speed, playing at this level, and it didn't work for them. You don't have to really worry about with Keandre Lambert-Smith, because you're taking a guy from the 2 biggest conferences, the Big Ten and the SEC. So you feel pretty good about what he can bring to that room, especially, got a chance to talk with him after his visit. He was really excited about playing with a guy like Cam Coleman, teaching those young guys up a little bit. And Jason, I know while I was out on vacation, you got a chance to talk with his high school coach as well, who visited with Keandre. So they're obviously very close. He took that Auburn visit with him, so they're still very close, and you got a chance to catch up with him a little bit.
Yeah, I think the most interesting thing about Keandre is the fact that when you watch him play, you go, he's just smooth. And you don't normally associate smooth with fast. You normally associate smooth with, he just, kind of glides. Then you look up and the guy's got 2 80-yard plus touchdown catches, 3 over 70 yards. And you see him pulling away from guys. It makes everything look easy. And so the one thing that his coach talked about, his high school coach, over and over again, was how this guy wants to pour into other guys. And you mentioned it, hey, how he comes in as a veteran guy. He said he wants to lead a room. That's what he wants to do. And this is a group of guys. I mean, this guy's played at Penn State. He's played Ohio State. He's played Michigan. He's come to Auburn and played. And so he has played in some really big games and some big moments. And so when you start talking about an addition like that, I think it's huge for, this wide receiver group and this offense when you start talking about the potential. And right now, potential, that's all it is. But we see much more potential from this Auburn passing game than we've seen in quite a while. And there's a lot more weapons. And you're going to have to, as a defense, figure out, okay, we're going to have to play them straight up. Teams haven't had to do that in a long time. They haven't had to play Auburn straight up. I mean, we basically saw last year teams say, I dare you. The teams that didn't say that were the New Mexico States of the world, and they were able to go, okay, well, here's what we're going to do. We're going to run blitz you and do those things. Other teams play straight up because they said, look, Auburn was able to run the football and do some things. Like, look, you're not going to be good enough to beat us even one-on-one. And so now you got guys that can win one-on-one battles, and he's another one of those guys. And so I think he can play inside and outside, which is also beneficial because you can move him around and not let teams kind of figure out what you're doing based on personnel, based on formation. He can be a trigger guy. Robert Lewis can be another one of those guys. You got a couple of those guys that you can move around to give you different looks with the same personnel.
Yeah, I mean, you talked about leadership a little bit. Robert Lewis is a guy who got a ton of praise for that in the spring, but he's still a quieter guy. Talking with a source there at Auburn, they were saying Keandre Lambert-Smith is exactly like Robert Lewis, but a little bit more vocal. He's going to be that leader for this room, but he's more vocal. And I was thinking about it. It's quietly a really fun, interesting wide receiver room. You talk about the young guys. Sam Jackson's basically a young guy. When you look at his experience at wide receiver, he hasn't had any since high school. He needs that leadership from guys like Keandre Lambert-Smith, from guys like Robert Lewis. Then you talk about the Cam Colemans, the Perry Thompson, the Malcolm Simmons that are still coming in, Bryce Kane, who's already there, Camden Brown, who had a really good spring practice and a good A-Day game. It's a receiver room that I'm genuinely curious to see what happens in fall practice, what happens in the season. I think it's a fun room in a sense of just, I think there's a lot of talent there, but it'll be interesting to see kind of how things play out. And Keandre is obviously now a big piece of that.
Yeah, and it's a receiver room that now, I'm trying to think, is Camden Brown the only guy remaining in this wide receiver group? Sorry,
Caleb Burton as well.
Yeah, but I'm talking about Camden Brown's the guy that's pre Hugh Freeze.
Yeah,
that's it.
Yeah,
you got one guy. One guy in this wide receiver group that is not 16 or 17 months on campus. That's the entirety of a wide receiver group, except for one guy has come in with Hugh Freeze. So it's been a complete rebuild. We've seen it on the offensive line, but I don't know that anywhere it's been more pronounced than it's been a wide receiver.
Yeah, and like you said, Jason, like it is at this point, it's still all potential. A lot of these guys, like you just said, because they're fairly new on campus, a lot of these guys haven't proven anything in an Auburn uniform. And there is obviously the question, going back to that question from the message board, there is obviously still the question of what is Peyton Thorne going to do to be able to improve? What is the offense going to be able to do in terms of a coaching perspective to put him in a better position to succeed? But at the end of the day, it does feel like the room has a higher floor now. Coy Moore is the guy who entered the transfer portal today. Jay Fair entered the portal. Going back to the spring, you had Malcolm Johnson transfer out. Javarius Johnson is probably a guy that they maybe would have liked to have around, but Amari Kelly, not saying that they didn't want to have those guys around, but it feels like we talked about it since Hugh Freeze got here, flipping the talent across the roster. You mentioned it, Jason. Offensive line is one where you feel like they've really done that. Starting to feel that way at wide receiver. Because you just look around and you kind of down to your fifth or sixth guy right now, whatever this lineup looks like, you feel like you're already in a better place than last year, just because of the talent of these guys. And we'll see what they're able to do. We'll see how much they rely on a true freshman like Cam Coleman. I would think they will, but that's still a question mark at the end of the day. Lambert-Smith is probably as close to a sure thing as you're going to get in the transfer portal, because he comes from the Power 5 level, but we shall see. Sam Jackson is kind of an experiment still. We'll see what goes on with him. And so, but like Christian was saying, that ceiling raiser, a big play wide receiver from Penn State, who was going to be the top returning receiver in the Big Ten. Like, there's no way to argue against that being a big pickup for your passing game. As we sit here on Wednesday, like I said, the portal is closed. We'll see if anything else comes trickling in, but as of right now, Auburn had 6 guys enter the portal in the spring window. Brenton Williams, the pass rusher. J.D. Rim, who was already off the team after being dismissed in the spring, he entered the portal. Jay Fair, he was their top returning wide receiver, actually, because after Javarius Johnson left, it was down to him. He's landed at USC already. Wesley Steiner at linebacker, that was one that I don't think surprised us too much. We were already talking about linebacker and them trying to get a new player in there. Colton Hood is a guy that we haven't talked about on this show. Jason sort of alluded to it when he took him on his roster draft team, but interesting situation that we'll talk about in a second with him, and then Coy Moore as well. The Colton Hood thing, just to kind of touch on it real quick, I had a chance to talk to him yesterday. I just put a story on our site, and I mean, we all really like Colton here. He's been somebody who's been really fun to be around. But he talked about just wanting to play with his brother. And then, Christian, you were kind of bringing me up to speed on Brandon Hood, who was a running back from Georgia, 3-star running back who had some pretty good offers, but then had a pretty big injury, ended up signing as a walk-on at Georgia, Colorado comes in and gives him a scholarship. And look, this is what Colton said, but he said honestly, most of it came down to just wanting to play with my brother. And so I thought that was a kind of a good perspective from him of a guy that we thought had a pretty good chance to be contributing. And he pretty much confirmed as much. He was like, yeah, I mean, I was rotating right there with Keontae in the spring. That's what he said. And we saw that to be true. And so it was an interesting transfer. I know some people were interested to kind of know what went on there because he was positioned to have a role in this defense. But I mean, from according to him, according to his side of the story, it was just a situation of wanting to be with his brother and wanting to play with his brother. He said it was kind of always a dream of theirs in college. So.
Yeah, I mean, Jason, your mic is muted, but I think we're on the same page here. I wish him the best of luck. I really like Colton. He was a really fun recruit to be around, really fun to be around still now. Definitely wish him the best of luck. I don't know if I necessarily agree with the decision, but I'm not on that side of the table. I don't see those exact discussions. So all you can do is kind of wish him the best of luck and hope for the best.
Yeah, I agree. Great kid. You got a chance to get to know him really well. And like I said, hopefully has a great career and does those things. And, from an Auburn perspective now, you look at it and obviously Auburn now looks to bring in a DB, later this week, this weekend from San Jose State. Antonio Kite now more in the forefront, the transfer from Alabama, originally from Anniston. J.C. Hart's a guy that I think these coaches feel like has a huge upside as he continues to mature and develop. Jalen Crawford that came in had a good spring, the true freshman. Mm-hmm. And so you start to look at it and go, from a number standpoint, still in pretty good shape. But now you get back to the veteran side of things. And I think that's where you start going, okay, what do you need? Because Kayan Lee hadn't played a bunch of football either. And so he's played, but you got Keontae Scott, who hasn't played a bunch of corner. He's played more nickel. Can you go out and find a veteran, proven corner that's played a lot of football, one-year guy, again, bridge the gap to the guys that you really like? That's kind of the roadmap that looks like Auburn, see if they're able to get a guy like that. But that appears to be the roadmap for them, is to try to find a guy to get you to those other guys to help you in a pinch. Because if you something happens this year, if you don't bring in somebody else as inexperienced as it gets. Antonio Kite's played some. Anybody else played any. And so that would be a tough spot to be in.
If any Colorado writers are looking to start a video series, we never got the chance. We had this back pocketed, Under the Hood. If you need a video series title name with Colton Hood, Under the Hood. Never got to use that. So we're
waiting on that one when it never got a chance to use it. So
so there you go. Nathan, do you want to try and start rolling through some of these other questions real quick? Do you think that's good?
Yeah, let's do it. And then we can y'all can talk a little bit about your recruiting trip this week and anything else on that front. We will start with HCIW, who has been very involved on the board recently in the basketball talk. So we appreciate that. He asks, given the current basketball roster plus Miles, who seems like a given, what are your expectations for the Hoop squad next year? There's probably going to be top 10 preseason buzz for this team. This is with the assumption that, number one, they get Duke Miles and they have that combo point guard. And then number two, take your pick of a guy at the 4 spot. I don't think they're going to get anybody who really moves the needle that much at power forward, because I don't think they want to run off Chaney Johnson. I think Bruce Pearl thinks that highly of Chaney Johnson. And look, Jason, I think it's interesting. We're sort of seeing in real time how different coaches do things, because Bruce Pearl is saying, I don't want to run off Chaney Johnson. Other coaches, and I'm not saying there's a right or wrong way to do it, but other coaches are saying, let me get as many good players as possible and figure that part out later. The thing for Pearl, and the reason he can do this, he's proven he can do it. He proved he could do it last year with a team that was deep and didn't play as many minutes, and they thought that they had kind of good complementary players. I mean, they did. They went too deep at every position. So he's capable of doing that at Alabama, at Michigan, at Kansas right now, certainly at Arkansas. They're bringing in everybody that they can. And so,
even Duke, which hasn't done it. We're seeing teams that haven't done it go into the portal who are also recruiting high school guys. We're seeing guys go, hey, look, we need more veteran presence. I think that's the thing I look at for this roster, Nathan. I mean, it's like you look at it and go, like you got like guys that play a lot of basketball, and you got 2 veterans coming in to join guys that played together. It's an intriguing roster. Here's the only thing: we just don't know what the rest of the league's going to look like. You get a feel for it, but you just in normally 10 years ago, if you knew what this roster Auburn looked and you knew what everybody else looked like, you go up. Now we'll have a better idea in a couple of months of okay, what's everybody going to look like? We have no idea what Arkansas is going to look like. Kentucky, and you're going to play all these teams. Alabama, how do they finish up? Does anybody leave before this thing? There's so many things we just don't know. I do think this is another team that you're going to look up and you go, hey, give themselves a chance to be there at the end. This team gave themselves a chance to be there at the end. Couldn't survive a bad game. That's it. You survive the Yale game. Who knows? This team might make the Final Four. That's the luck. That's the way it goes in the NCAA tournament. But man, they won an SEC tournament championship and won a bunch of games. I think they'll be a similar type team.
This will be a tournament team. I mean, I think there's little doubt at this point that if Bruce Pearl is able to put together a roster that he likes, that it's going to be a team that most likely makes the NCAA tournament. Yeah, like Jason said, we're so far zoomed out at this point. Concrete expectations I think are kind of hard to come by. But again, I wouldn't be surprised if this is like a top 10, top 12 team in the preseason. Janai Broome will carry we would be having so many different conversations if he wasn't back.
It'd be quite different.
That fills so many boxes for you.
Yeah, especially if you. I mean, this could be a much different team too. They could be if you play Broome and Dylan Cardwell together, and you have Chad Baker-Mazara, and you had this could be a big half-court UConn type of team. I mean, you could play that style, and they did some of that last year, even though they didn't play the 4 and 5 those bigs together very much. They played more half-court basketball and more set basketball than we've seen a Bruce Pearl team. They may be more of that this year with a team like this, and I don't know. There's lots of things that could look a little different for this team, but I expect the same thing to be that they'll be a pretty good team.
Yeah, I think that the reason that you haven't seen, it feels like every day you look up and a lot of these other teams are making transfer additions. The thing to remember if you're Auburn, and I understand people kind of doing that, looking up and seeing other places get good players. A lot of places are having to do that because they're having to replenish more than half their roster. Auburn got Chad Baker-Mazara back. Auburn got Janai Broome back. Dylan Cardwell, Chris Moore, Denver Jones. Like, they have the core of this team back, so they're not having to do that. They're just kind of having to do some patchwork. But I agree with Jason that, number one, this could be the best the league has been in a really long time, and we say that every single year. But especially with what Kentucky is doing to reload, Arkansas is going to be a monster in terms of talent. We'll see how it plays out, but in terms of talent, and then Alabama's roster is going to be absurdly talented as well. But for Auburn specifically, just looking in-house for them, top 10, top 15 preseason team, I would say. We will move on here to W. Slay has a question for you, Jason. What moves does Butch make this offseason? Of course, talking about Butch Thompson and Auburn baseball as they get toward the end of things here.
Yeah, I think the first thing you have to look at is again, I had somebody ask me a couple weeks ago, hey, what's the roster look like next year? I'm like, I have no clue what the baseball roster. Then he finished. We don't know what the basketball roster is going to finish looking like. And, but you have to figure out, okay, first, who's back off this roster? Obviously, Ike Irish. That's probably job number one. Get Ike Irish back for another year. When you start looking at a guy like that, can you get Cooper McMurray back to give you that presence in the middle of the lineup? I think that's a possibility. I mean, I think in this NIL world, that's a guy that I think you can get back. Cam Tilley is a guy I think is a building block as that freshman group. But you got signees coming in. Obviously, you're going to be portal. How much of that can you go get? I think a couple of potential weekend starters, and can you find a number one? We saw it. They invested a lot into Joseph Gonzalez this year, and he just wasn't able to get back to form, which was a big deal for them. And Chase Alsop never really took that step, and so you were left with a team that had probably 5 or 6 guys that were legit 3 starters. But when you're throwing those guys out 1-2, it makes it really tough for everybody. So some pieces, the young pieces. Kay Ballou has been good. Kale Strickland's been good. Eric Guevara is a guy they really like at third base. So I think there's some pieces, but I think you're going to see them, be invested in the portal. And I think maybe even more from a pitching standpoint than they've been the last few years. But you got some, Chris Stanfields, and you got against, get Ike Irish and Cooper McMurray. Those guys from an offensive standpoint, can you get some building blocks? The young guys around them, fill in a few pieces from the portal, and I think obviously pitching heavy from the portal. But I think there's a lot of work to be done. There's no question. But once again, just like we were just talking about basketball, you build a roster, hope it works out, because you don't know what anybody else's roster looks like, because everybody's doing the same thing. And so it's like, hey, you feel good, but you go into it blind because you just don't know what anybody else is either. And when you look up and in this league, you had Texas and Oklahoma next year in baseball, pretty darn good programs. You look up and LSU sitting here 7-14 in the league. Auburn won one last week, could have won twice. LSU has Texas A&M next, who's the number 1 team in the country. They get them at home, but then they're in Alabama, they're in Ole Miss. 9 games left. 13-17 is bare bones minimum to get into the NCAA tournament, which means if you're LSU, you're gonna have to go 6-3 against the remaining schedule to not be the 3rd straight national champion in this league, to then not make the NCAA tournament the next year. It's insane. It's crazy. But that's what you live in. Florida played for the national championship last year. They won a non-conference game last night to be 2 games over 500 overall. And you got to be 500 going into the SEC tournament. You got to be 500 at the end of the year to make the NCAA tournament. Florida's got Tennessee and Kentucky and Georgia, their last 3 series. So it's just a brute. And I think for Auburn, you know what you got to do. You got to go get better on the mound and try to get you some starting pitching.
Christian, I will send this one straight to you and Jason as well, from Himothy, which, by the way, I guarantee this person is age 22 or younger. Juju Lewis update. We're talking about that before we got rolling. He is the man that everybody wants to know about. What you got for us, Christian?
Yeah, I actually kind of want to lump this in with the next question as well from Clark Dickerson. What wide receivers do you think Auburn gets in this recruiting cycle? Because I think what happens with Juju Lewis will greatly affect the second question. In terms of Juju Lewis, it's pretty well whittled down to a 3-team race as of now. Georgia's out after taking a commitment from Ryan Montgomery, the quarterback from Ohio. USC is obviously where he's committed. It's been that way since August of last year when he was in the 2026 class. Obviously is reclassified now to 2025. And it's kind of all quiet on the Western Front a little bit, which is not necessarily a bad thing, because when he got done taking all of his spring visits, it was Auburn that kind of felt maybe the most optimistic and maybe in the best spot in terms of where they stand. It's Auburn, USC, Colorado. Alabama's also in the mix as a 4th team. Could maybe get that official visit spot where he was supposed to go to Georgia, but isn't anymore now. So Alabama, the 4th team to kind of watch there. But really, it's Auburn, USC, and Colorado. And going into those summer official visits, it feels like Auburn, I don't want to say the team to beat, but I'll say the biggest threat to USC right now, and could keep him close to home as well. And then as for the second question from Clark, Jason, this is something that we've talked about with other people. What wide receivers do you think Auburn gets in this recruiting cycle? If I had to pin down 2 right now, because I don't know if they'll take more than 2, maybe 3, I would say what I put in my first mock class: CJ Wiley from Milton, teammates with Ryan G. And I'll say TK Norman has a good camp in June, and Auburn takes his commitment after that, similar to like a Bryce Canner or Malcolm Simmons. However, if you get Juju Lewis, there will be no shortage of wide receivers or tight ends that will be knocking on the door looking for a spot to join your class. Guys like Caleb Cunningham, Dallas Wilson, the Oregon commit, Travis Smith from Westlake. CJ Wiley obviously is already a huge one. That should not be discounted as a low-hanging fruit. That's a guy that they really, really want. So if you get Juju Lewis, everything changes for Auburn's class. It would not be a stretch to say that if you were to get Juju Lewis to flip from USC, that it's the biggest recruiting win and for Auburn, and I don't know, but it would be. I mean, Cam Coleman was obviously ginormous last year, and you're seeing that now. And getting Cam Coleman is helping you with Juju Lewis, but just think about the guys that Juju Lewis can help you with, being from the state of Georgia, and how much you try and attack the South.
Yeah, I don't know that. I don't know that there would be one comparable for me because of how long he's been a top recruit, and because of how many people now know him and how many people he's crossed paths with, and what kind of draw it'd be. I mean, like Jason Campbell was a big time recruit, but he's from Mississippi, and social media just kind of starting, and it was such a different world. Cam was a junior college guy that everybody's like, hey, this guy's a big deal, but a lot of people are like, that guy's been in junior college. They knew his stats looked pretty good in his film, but Juju Lewis has connections and has relationships with a lot of these guys, and that's where it could be a big deal. And so, I think that one would be one that would alter the landscape of Auburn's entire class if you bring a guy like that in at the quarterback position.
And the 2026 class and the next class for that matter.
Mm-hmm.
I went and did some quick digging. Juju Lewis on Instagram, 133,000 followers. Juju Lewis on TikTok, 40,000 followers. Juju Lewis on Twitter, 31,000 followers. He would definitely bring a brand to Auburn. That is for sure. He has a good following among his peers and among other people as well. So it would be the flashiest recruiting win for Auburn maybe ever. I think I can say that confidently.
Well, and just from a football perspective too, just number one guy, like this changes your trajectory. It would if they were to land him. Massively improves your trajectory and sort of, I think, cements Hugh Freeze because Walker White is still there and is still the quarterback they believe in for the future. But it's like it cements Hugh Freeze as this is a guy who's going to get a really good quarterback for this team every single year, and that's what Freeze wants to do at Auburn, and certainly Juju Lewis.
And the other thing that is a must, and it wasn't done enough at Auburn in the last 25 years that I've been doing this job. It hasn't been enough. It's felt like forever that Auburn got a guy and went, okay, we're done. We're done. That's going to be our guy. We'll get another guy in a few years. That is not how it works. Hugh Freeze understands it. You better go get a guy, and every year try to get a guy better than that guy. That has to be the goal. You have to do that, or you can't do it. Because I mean, look at Alabama. Alabama's going to the portal. Georgia's going to the portal. Duke's going to the portal in basketball because you don't win them all. You might win all the recruiting battles, but that don't mean all those guys are going to pan out. And people for years have talked about Alabama's development. Yeah, their development's great, but they also miss on as many guys as everybody else does. They just have a whole lot more of them. You can afford the misses, and nobody forgets about those guys that transfer out because the other guys produced. Yeah, because when you have 70 4- and 5-star guys versus 20, when you hit on your success rate of 50%, that's still 35 really good players versus 10. That's the difference. You better have more of those guys, and that is what this staff understands. And hey, look, you feel good. You can feel good about your position and still go shoot for the moon and go, hey, we need to get better. And I think that's what they're going to do.
We have one more question here that let's see if you guys can help me answer from Texas Auburn grad. Does anyone else notice how bad Thorne's first quarters are? And how do we fix that? I cannot say that I, off the top of my head, have remembered that, but I will say that Auburn's passing game and the RPO system last year was certainly clunky, and it did not go very smoothly. And I think you sort of heard from Thorne in the spring. He was talking specifically about a change they made, but I think just overall getting the offense to the point where, I mean, I hate to say that it's what Freeze's Auburn career will be, or his Auburn tenure will be built on, because it's just one of several things. But that RPO thing, I mean, that's very, very crucial to him. And so I think that's a big part of this season is, and I'll be interested to see early in the year and in preseason camp, how smooth that looks and how much farther along they feel like they can be with Thorne. Because that is one of the worst signs of an RPO system is when it looks hard. It's not supposed to look hard. That's the whole point of an RPO is it's supposed to look easier, and it's supposed to be a one read system where you're sort of making a check at the line of scrimmage and then going from there. So that's not a perfect answer to this question, but I will say that is, I think, part of kind of the clunkiness of Auburn's offense that you saw last season was the fact that they just never, from receiver to quarterback, and everybody else involved in the offense, they never felt like they were on the same page with the RPO, and that is probably priority number one this season, because they feel like with that system, Free's been doing it for a decade. Feels like if you get that rolling, everything else is going to fall into place, especially when you have better players now.
Yeah, no, yeah, everything about last year, and obviously some of us on Peyton Thorne, and Hugh Freeze talked about it all year, but the lack of those guys, I'm trying to think, it's not continuity, because there was no continuity at all. I mean, he wasn't on campus. Half his receivers weren't on campus. Those guys didn't go through spring practice, and everybody's learning a new system. And so it never really felt like that anybody had any confidence in what they were doing. And it showed on the field. Combine that with receiving core that didn't make many plays and dropped a bunch of passes. And hey, Peyton Thorne didn't play perfect either. But you had it all come together where it looked ugly. It looked ugly a lot of the time. I think you have more weapons outside. You have a staff that's on the same page, and you have a quarterback that's playing in a system that he played in all the way back to high school. I think those are things that make everybody feel a lot more comfortable when you step out on the field game one than they ever were last season, in my opinion.
Well, and the thing that I would add too is, Hugh Freeze said it after games last year. He was actively trying to slow the games down. He was actively trying to keep his defense fresh because he didn't feel confidence in the depth that they had and that they'd be able to hold up for the full game. And for that matter, that the offense would have enough explosiveness to keep a drive going. And that's why he was trying to slow the game down. So I think maybe that could contribute to slow starts in the first quarter a little bit.
I don't think there's any question about that. And I think, I think the worst thing that happened to Auburn last year was playing the way they did against Georgia. Because if you go out there and lose to Georgia 42-6 and you don't have anything going, then I think they pull the plug earlier and say, look, we got to go score. And then I think it gave them a false sense of hope that, hey, this is how we need to play this way. And then the offense kept stagnant. They never moved forward because, again, they weren't going tempo. They weren't going fast. And once they started doing those things, Arkansas was the best game of the year. Vandy was another pretty good one. Now, those teams weren't great, but they finally got something going where they were able to move the football and have a little fun, a little pace. And I think we're going to see a lot more of that this year.
Yep, for sure. I mean, it's what it all boils down to. It is such a big thing for this team this season. I mean, it's we can talk about receiver, we can talk about Peyton Thorne, we can talk about Cam Coleman, we can talk about Derek Nix and Hugh Freeze taking things over. It's got to all marry together, and it's the biggest on-field storyline for this team certainly this year is getting that passing game to improve. That is all the questions we have here, guys. If you guys want to get into any, Christian, I don't know if you had any recruiting stuff you wanted to check off, and you guys usually do your podcast.
We can touch on real quick going down to Enterprise. We already touched on Eric Winters. Well, I referenced him in reference to the South Alabama guy, but Jason, we can just touch on that. Got to go see those three guys: Eric Winters, Zion Grady, Andrew Purcell. All three 2025 targets to know. Eric Winters and Zion Grady, you don't find too many targets bigger on the board for Auburn. Grady at the buck linebacker position, Winters, hybrid safety star, was a linebacker. Still think eventually maybe he could grow into that position as well, but being recruited by Charles Kelly as a star in the defense now. Purcell, a guy who hasn't been offered yet, but Auburn's going to go by Enterprise, I believe, next week to go and see them, evaluate him a little bit. He could maybe be a camp guy as well that could show up for a camp and earn an offer or something like that if he chooses to as well. So, look, those are three really good guys on the defense. In terms of talking to Winters and Grady, two really nice kids, two very quiet kids. It's hard to get a lot out of them a little bit, but we definitely both feel like Auburn sits in a really good spot for both of them after talking with them again.
Yeah, they're in the picture. Eric Winters said maybe a week or two. He may make a decision, even though he's going to take all of his official visits in the month of June after the decision. Zion Grady's saying, hey, right around the 4th of July, maybe on the 4th for him. Didn't feel like that was as set as I think hoping to be the 4th of July. But Zion's a guy that Charles Henderson transferred from Charles Henderson and Troy to Enterprise, and you look at him physically, and that's what it's supposed to look like at that position. He's explosive, a guy that's still just scratching the surface. Eric Winters, we've been watching Eric play basketball for 2 years. We've seen him play football. We have seen a bunch of Eric Winters, and he just does everything well. You look at him, and that's the kind of guy you look and go, hey, I don't know where he winds up. All I know is you want him on your team.
Jason, I loved your player comparison for him.
Yeah, I can't remember who I did.
Derwin James.
Yes, that's it. I mean, and I think when you think about Charles Kelly, and you think about his past, Derwin James is a guy that was a big physical safety, can run, can cover, can do all that. That's Eric Winters. That's who he is. And we get there, and they have special teams first, and he's catching punts, and he's doing all these things, and you go, man, a guy that looks like that's not supposed to do that. Kind of reminds me a little bit of DeMarcus Riddick, and Riddick's a little bit bigger, and so more of a true linebacker, but same kind of guy. You look at it just to go, hey, man, this guy's a great athlete, smart, is moving around. They're playing at linebacker. They're playing him at safety. They put him on the edge a little bit. He plays quarterback. He's played running back. Fun day in Enterprise, and we got several more road trips coming up here the next couple of weeks as these teams really get now into the heart and the heat of spring practice.
Yeah, look, if you want to just know how talented Enterprise is and kind of what they've got going down there, most importantly, Jason was down there, but then T-Rob and Glenn Schumann from Georgia were there. Clemson's defensive coordinator was there. Michigan had a coach there. So that's a pretty good cast of characters that you have for a Tuesday afternoon practice in Enterprise, Alabama.
Yeah, always good to get to hang out with T-Rob Travaris Robinson, now at Georgia, obviously, and a guy that my first year on the job was a freshman, his freshman year. And so, known that guy a long time, and he is still the same personality and character than he was then. So fun times.
Well, we appreciate everybody for tuning in. I don't know if you guys have anything else you want to check off, but we're a little bit past 45 minutes here. So we will see everybody over at auburnundercover.com. All these questions here are from our folks on the message board. It's been a really fun last few days on the board. There's no off season. Things might get slow here or there for certain parts of it, but then they crank right back up with transfers and transfer visits, and obviously the camp season. I saw they put out that schedule today. I know that's going to be Christian and Jason's time to shine here in just a little bit. And so always stuff going on. AuburnUndercover.com. We appreciate everybody for listening to this podcast. If you guys like it, go leave us a 5-star review. The bumper music is by Beats by Mordecai. You guys can follow him on Twitter, SoundCloud, and Instagram. Until the next episode, we will catch you guys later. Everybody have a great rest of your week, and we will talk to you soon.